Lydia Manning is Professor of Gerontology at Concordia University. Dr. Manning's research and teaching agendas reflect her commitment to the interdisciplinary exploration of aging in the United States. And as a social gerontologist, she investigates complex and pressing issues and problems related to aging, health, and well-being through independent research that integrates the perspectives and methodologies of gerontology, sociology, and women's studies. Specifically, her research focuses on resilience with related interests in religion, health, and gender. Welcome, Lydia.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Great to have you.
Yeah, I'm excited. I've never done a Picha Kucha presentation. So I'm excited to see how this goes. And I was thinking as I was putting it together, wow, asking an academic to condense everything into 6 minutes and 40 seconds, right? That's
I know, it's reduction.
Yeah, but we're going to see how this goes. Yeah, thank you for giving context. I'm sad that Lewis's camera froze. He was captivating.
Same, and hopefully we'll have him to finish up after your presentation.
Jump back in. You know, I think the whole the cyclical nature of this is important, and I loved his comments about, you know, if you're going to teach death and dying, you should probably think about teaching birth and living. I had a death doula in one of my trainings once tell me that she worked as a birth doula 3 days a week and a death doula on kind of a moonlighting fashion. And she said that you can trust the human body to get here. It knows exactly how to get here, and it knows exactly how to get out of here. Right? Like you can see it happen. So, okay, I'm going to share my screen with everybody and get started. All right, you can see what I see, everyone, right? Okay. So welcome everyone, and thank you for your interest in my Picha Kucha presentation. I'm going to address some of the key trends we're seeing right now in aging and dying. As Mark said, my name is Lydia Manning, and I'm a social gerontologist currently employed, hopefully for a little while longer, as a professor of gerontology at Concordia University, Chicago. I appreciate being able to connect and serve older adults both personally and professionally. I've often sought solace in their companionship, and I've appreciated their willingness to be who they most authentically are. Research and personal conviction remind me that as a person nears the end of life, what matters most comes glaringly into focus. Gerontologists love to argue that aging studies is not death studies. And while I understand that, and I understand that gerontology is technically the study of aging processes and individuals across the life course, we have a reality that aging and death are highly correlated, more so than in any other time in human history. So I would argue you really can't study aging without studying dying. And there's an art to both aging and dying. I think unfortunately we exist in a cultural milieu where we're in many ways shamed for doing both. I think gerophobia and thanatophobia are alive and well. And I do believe that much of our pervasive and ubiquitous ageism is linked to our collective fear of death and dying. And this is what happens when we deny, I believe, some of our most natural and essential processes. And, you know, those are what we're programmed to do, right? We're programmed to age and we're programmed to die. More and more people are living longer, and more people are about to die. We have the opportunity as experts and as storytellers, and for many of us who are movers and shakers, to shift some of these misconceptions and address some of these phobias and isms and really lead the way in how we reframe not only how we age as a society, but also how we die, and also what we do with our postmortem bodies. Key trends in aging obviously include addressing the aging population. You know, we'll heard the statistics, right? That every day 10,000 people turn 65. There are roughly 53 million people over the age of 65 today, and that's expected to increase to 82 million by 2050. Life expectancy is increasing as well. So, you know, if all these people are aging, and we know that death and mortality are highly correlated, then all those people are going to die. Other key trends, right? Happiness is a trend for older adults. Older people report higher levels of happiness than their younger counterparts, higher levels of life satisfaction, even in the face of loss and adversity and potential declines in well-being. Additional trends include growing ethnically diverse populations, a compression of the comorbidity curve, so people are living longer and delaying the onset of disability. And with greater longevity, we're seeing new patterns of family life. Another trend, right, is breaking up this myth that elders are living out their end of their lives in nursing homes. Nursing home use is declining, although given right now with COVID, there's such a crisis happening. But on average, right, people aren't dying in nursing homes, and people are trying to age in place and stay in a community as long as they can. And I think you can see that trend also with people, how they wish to die, right? People want to die at home and they don't want to die in institutions. But if you look at the data, that's exactly where most people are dying, right? Usually in hospitals. Similar trends in aging over the last several decades have occurred. And one of the biggest trend is our willingness to consider death. And to converse about it, and to think about, death, dying, and beyond. I would argue that we're in the midst of a death positive movement, where most everything associated with death is getting reimagined. Not only, right, here we're talking about the cemetery, but I think in general, you're seeing, how people die, what they want to have happen to their bodies. All of that is getting reimagined. And we're actually considering thinking about death as good mental health. And we're striving for a better death, and that's also part of living well. Changing trends related to dying are being fueled, I think, by an aging population. Many boomers nearing death, they don't want a quote unquote bad death. Mark, you made the point, right? As formal religion declines, I think we're seeing new rituals around death arise. And I would argue that we're a pretty ritual poor culture, if you will, mainstream culture, particularly around transitions in later life. And I think some of that's also true with death. So you're seeing people get more creative and, considering what new burial practices may look like. And that, ranges from radically green burials to other out of the box thinking. And I'm sure we'll explore some of that today. So this looks, it might look like planning for one's funeral or an end of life celebration. Perhaps people are, excited about participating in the death tourism movement. I think there's a rise of people communing with mediums or seeking death wisdom from other cultures. And so in many ways right now, death is a growing industry. And I don't think that that's cold or calculating, it's fact, right? Again, I think when you have people living longer, and we've put about 30 years additional onto our life expectancy in this century, when you have long-lived lives, you can delay death, but yet it's still inevitable. So it's important to remember that the modern culture of extreme death fearing is a pretty recent phenomenon, right? I mean, I think that's what happens when you turn everything over to medicalized experiences. And we've outsourced death care, right, for these last several decades, along, I would argue, with birth care. So no wonder people have a little bit of anxiety. But I think that that's changing, and I'm excited that people can come together to discuss death, dying, and what we do with our postmortem bodies. I think it invites an opportunity to consider what life and death may look like postmortem in the context of the space that we create to honor and care for our dead. And one example is the cemetery. Imagine strolling through a cemetery at night, the wooded path softly illuminated by a canopy of glowing pods, filled with human remains suspended overhead and transforming decomposition into electricity until the body is finally gone. The cycle of life is complete, the light then dims to dark, the pod taken down and replaced by a bright new body shining down upon the path from its starlight grave. While this may sound like stuff of science fiction, in reality, it's a reimagined cemetery. And with that, I conclude.
Great. Thank you, Lydia. So I'd like to open the floor up for questions if anyone has some questions for Lydia on what she presented to us. I'll start with the first question. I'm just curious, from your perspective, are you seeing change in hospitals to bring on a more sensitive environment for terminally ill patients? I know many now have hospice wings, but the environment still seems quite institutional in those places.
Yeah, I mean, I can speak from anecdotal experience just in the Chicagoland area and through, trying to put my own death doula training into practice. There's one hospital in the area that has the NODA program, the No One Dies Alone program, maybe two. And I think there is a sensitivity, and I would imagine it starts usually with the volunteer department or the chaplaincy program. But I think that I wish I could say, yeah, there's a big shift happening in hospitals, but I think that we're so still beholden to the medical model where we see and conceptualize death as failure in those spaces. And so while you would think there would be a likely breeding ground for sensitivity, I do think it's still overly medicalized.
Mm-hmm.
And you don't see, well, and that's in the traditional model, but they send a van to pick up the body, not a hearse, right? I mean, there's still this sort of, wait, there's the morgue, and that, it's just, I think there's still some anxiety, right, in those spaces. Lynn's
Sure.
asking, what is picha kucha?
Kacha
Is
is,
that how you say it? It's
yes,
Japanese for chit chat, right? Like
that's right.
it's this model where you put together 20 slides that transition every 20 seconds, and you speak to that time frame, and you're supposed to keep it in that short, sort of drop more seeds for thoughts, right? It's meant to spur conversation, and it's
Yes, it was developed by architects because they were having conferences and finding people going on way too long. So they forced this format where you get 20 seconds to talk about one of 20 images, and it forces you into a 6-minute presentation. So it really gets you to have to pull out the gems and make a good presentation so we could have more people talk, which is great for today.
Lydia,
the gerontology meetings next year. We just had them virtually this year. Be a good format for academics to use too.
Lydia, just one comment, and I have a question. Really, when you said, the hospital, it says no one dies alone. I think one of the aspects we need to take consideration is whatever we're planning, whatever we're creating, is that going to be accessible to people across socioeconomic lines?
Right.
Because a lot of the dying, right now, what happens is very expensive.
Oh, yeah.
I know in Illinois, just cremation alone can be $1,000, $2,000, $3,000, $4,000, $5,000. So, are we creating something that will heal the divisiveness we have in society right now, or are we creating spaces where the privilege will be able to engage in that particular experience, and the less privileged, not so. So, that speaks to also the relationship that we have, not just to the particular family, but to the larger society. When we're creating a process, we want a process that says, no one dies alone, and afterwards, no one has to be alone because of lack of access. Lydia, the question I always ask is, what did this experience that you've been having have on you?
In terms
of your relationship to your own death and dying, or a loved one?
Yeah, I mean, I've really, for me, working in the field of gerontology and thinking about aging in older adults and what's happening right now with COVID in nursing homes particularly, I've had to remind myself that, and this is my worldview and my belief framework, right? So I'm not imposing it on anybody, but I have occupied space with people, and I have been a midwife in their dying process, and I've physically and emotionally and in many ways spiritually witnessed it. And something happens in that moment, and I guess I find comfort where I don't know that I believe that anyone ever really truly dies alone. I think in that transition space, because we're energetic creatures, and I believe that post-death, we maintain energetic consciousness, that we're not alone in those transitions, right? Even if we're physically in a room by ourselves, and so for me, that's comforting. But to answer your question too, it's interesting, the older I get, I started in gerontology 20 years ago, right? So I'm in my early 40s, and I recognize that that's middle-aged. It's not older ages, but as I age, right, it becomes less and less of an other, right? Like it's an incremental experience. And so I guess I don't fear aging, and I don't deny it. And I guess I would feel the same about death. You know, I don't have a fear of the moment. I do get a little anxiety about just, I'm sure, when someone's giving birth, what happens when you get wrapped up in that medical model, because it happens even if you fight it hard. I mean, you can have your DNR written, you can have all of your orders, ducks in a row, but there's a lack of control that is tangible in those spaces. And I think that gives me more anxiety than the actual transitioning.
Lydia, I wanted to ask, I really appreciated your comments where you talked, and I totally agree with this idea that we are a ritual poor culture or society here. And I'm not so familiar with your work in the No One Dies Alone or the death doula work that you do, but I'm just curious if you have witnessed or worked with families or larger communities to develop models of ritual or ways of addressing this that are beyond getting your DNR, you know, the medical model that you talked about that's in place, but what other models are out there, even if they're very rudimentary? I mean, I think that's a really interesting conversation to the group of people here. So.
Yeah, I mean, for me, the focus of my work really is as a gerontologist, right? I'm an academic. I did my death doula training. I've spent time really watching other death doulas in practice. Some of them might be on the call today. Loretta's work, Mark referenced Loretta Downs, and she's amazing. I mean, I think her ritualistic work of creating that chrysalis room, where it's the space where people can have kind of a sensory, calming, soothing experience where they have control of their environment, is one model. Mm-hmm. There have been life celebrant work, right? People using art, people using music, having the moment where, almost like a birth plan, people create death plans where, if you know dying bodies, you can usually look and decide, probably we're looking at 3 hours, 4 hours maybe. And you can decide, like, who do you want around your bed? Do you want to have, what kind of music? Do you want aromatherapies? Do you want prayers being said? Do you want, I have a friend who's like, please don't read me Mary Oliver, right? I know how much you love Mary Oliver. Please do not read me out of your Mary Oliver book, right? So it's like, you can, I mean, there are those models. And, I think more from an aging perspective, right? I think not only do we lack rituals around death and dying, but I think we lack rituals to transition moving through our later years, where are the models of bridging to elder wise womanhood, I mean, we have, I think about some of the crone wisdom that people utilize, and what do those rituals look like? Mm-hmm. But I think this is what happens, right? When you have more and more people living longer and living older, and I think we're ripe to make meaning of it, and we're ripe for these rituals. But it becomes on us to create them, particularly in a more secular world, right, where we're moving away from some of the religious traditions.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Does that answer your question, Jason?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Okay.
Hey, Lydia, I thought that was really fantastic, and I'd like you, if you don't mind, to expand just a little bit more on, you said something really important. Death is not failure. You said regarding our medical system that, we obviously within the medical community think of death as a failure to the doctor. Can you speak a little more just about your thoughts on that notion?
No, I think because I'm an educator, right? I think, I don't know exactly what some of the curriculum looks like in med school. I'm not an MD, right? I tell my friends, don't cut yourself or have a heart attack, because I can't help you. I can theorize about it, but I can drive you somewhere. But no, I think I know this for a fact in terms of geriatric education, right? I mean, you're lucky to get a week-long module on aging in med school. And I would imagine it's similar for death and dying. Maybe you get a course, but I think that there's this, we're not teaching some of our healthcare providers, you know, about being empathetic and helping people transition. And, you know, we're taught to cure, and we're taught to delay death and to prevent it. And we spend so much money in those last 3 months of life doing that. Where I think if we can reframe it and reimagine it and have conversations with people about, okay, when is it enough? You know, I know that right now the Rahm Emanuel's, is it his brother? I Want to Die at 75. Did you read that article in The Atlantic? I think Joe Biden is selecting him for in a key role, but he's under a lot of criticism right now because he's saying, I'm done, I'm tapping out, I want to tap out at 75. And he provides a whole list of why he wants to do that. You can Google it and find it in The Atlantic. I think he wrote it in the spring, but you know, I think some of it's just about not giving providers education. And I think Toby wanted to say something about that.
Yes, thank you. Hello, thank you very much, everyone. So I'm calling from England, and it crossed my mind that there may be some cultural differences. And I said to Mark when I joined that, of course, we are very similar and yet actually very different in so many ways, the English and England and the Americas. That being said, what I've discerned from everything so far is no cultural difference, no difference in our appetite to understand, learn, communicate, and importantly, remain connected. The thing that I observed, Lydia, is that when I started on my own personal journey, as a journeyman, I've done all sorts of different things. Some of the very first people I met were at a death cafe, and they were clinicians, they were doctors. And I said, well, why are you here? And I had the pleasure of meeting John Underwood and meeting some of his fellows who started the movement. And they said, well, because we're really very bad at death. We're not told about death. And of course, if I think about this, and I'm not a particularly clever person, well, we are so disconnected because we're so jacked up on production, success, being happy, so on and so forth. And by default, you know, medicine is a profession, and therefore the relationship between death and failure is always there. And so we see that here, and it's very, very common for me to meet people from the medical profession who sort of amplify that. We have death doulas here. We also have a movement called soul midwives. A soul midwife is subtly different from a death doula, but essentially focused on helping in the same way and at the same time in life, that sort of process of transition. And we use them. We actively promote the use of a soul midwife if a family feels it's going to be helpful. Interestingly enough, when we talk because everything is prescribed over here, you know, you've got living, the dead bit, and then the bit after, and death is entirely prescribed, be it through religion. You know, I've often said that death has been politicized through religion, and therefore they've owned it for such a long period of time. We haven't really been able to express ourselves, which is important for some, less important for others. But the hospice movement over here, who do an amazing job, bearing in mind the hospitals are not designed for death. Over here, hospitals have very poor mortuary and small mortuary facilities. And so when someone dies, they want to get them out immediately. Pick up the phone, FD, please collect, done. It's often the case that bodies received from hospitals haven't been looked after as you might have hoped for. Lots of tubes and wires and things. But the hospices, interestingly enough, they of course, over here, limited example, not a scientific sample for sure, they like to control their world. So they're not necessarily open to soul midwives or death doulas being part of their process. And that element of control is something that I'm beginning to understand. It feels necessary. And yet, of course, by default, you know, my jacket's not going to fit Mark's back. right? Physically or emotionally. And I just wanted to share that because it strikes me that it's almost a mirror image as to what Mark and you, Lydia, have sort of referenced thus far.
Yeah, I would like to add they have a monopoly really on the industry. And there's a company out of the state of Washington called Recompose, who has broken through the legal barriers to allow another form of how we deal with body. It's almost a composting of the human body. And it was a political, legal battle to pierce that monopoly of control that you're talking about, Toby. But they've done it successfully, and hopefully that will now start spreading across the country so that we do have options that are outside the traditional conventions. Hey, Mark, can you mute your
Yeah, I know, I'm sorry.
Speaker?
But I was going to speak.
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
We're talking about death as a memorialize and as a kind of a long-term relationship. I know that with some religions, they memorialize and stay with the body as part of the grieving process. I'm not that familiar with it, but I know in the Orthodox Jewish community, apparently they wrap they embalm the body, but they care for the body during a certain amount of time. And I don't know much about that ritual, but that's certainly one way of honoring this journey for the people who are trying to take in what's happening and be present to it during this transitional period and embrace it with empathy so that they fully experience what's going on. Obviously, I've written a lot about empathy and connection in life, and I don't know that much about various religious ways of honoring. I view that there's some value in appreciating our forefathers in terms of what they've done. I'm curious if anyone knows about how this transitional period right after the death till the burial is honored by enabling people and their loved ones to be part of that process.
I think that was the traditional model up until a few hundred years ago. Deaths happened in the home, the community gathered at that home, the funeral and the display of the body was at the home. And over the last 100 or so years, a business industry has developed to take those processes away, if you will, maybe thinking that it was easing the burden to the family. But I think there's been a price to pay that we're not participants anymore in these rituals, and we're observers. And so the amount of healing that can take place, I think, is much diminished in this scenario.
Mark, may I just make one last reference, please?
Please.
So if people haven't heard of or read a book written by a lady over here called Catherine Mannix, M for mother, A-N-N-I-X, she wrote a book called With the End in Mind. From memory, I think it's 12 chapters, and each chapter deals with the death of an individual. And it is worth reading. I would volunteer that it's not worth reading in one go because it's quite draining, it's quite exhausting. But the one thing that I find interesting is, forgive me, the gentleman who spoke after you, Mark.
Mark Ingwer, my friend.
So there was a reference to death and violence. And in the last 100 years, everyone associates death with violence, whether you're a fan of Grand Theft Auto, whether you're a fan of a war movie, a Western, whether you've listened to your grandparents or your parents, which of course we should never forget is probably the most valuable audio ever. I say that as a failed parent who apparently lectures, so my children say. So that relationship between death and violence, I suspect that's absolutely, you know, formed in our mindset, and therefore the thought of seeing a dead body is terrifying. Now, I've seen my father-in-law, I've seen my father, I watched my father die. The last breath, 8:21 on the 1st of October 2018. I was really lucky because it was a good one, right? But I suspect most people can't understand that because we're all jacked up on TV and social media that our concept of death. And this is why I talk about Catherine Mannix, because she says, and I'll finish now, she says, the reality is it's really peaceful. You know, of course it can be traumatic. Of course it can. But actually, it's a remarkably peaceful process that is not that difficult to understand. Anyway, that's all I wanted to say. Sorry.
So that's all good. Thank you.
Can I come in for a couple of minutes and I'll finish up? And
Sure.
I want to respond. I want to pick